Time is here, and it may be really here this week. We shall see. Hey, for real, don't get out and get hurt. I know this is not wise, but I'm going to say it anyway. I grew up on a farm. I have never been snowed in. And by never, I mean never. So with that being said, I don't intend to start today. So if you need groceries, I'm your guy, for real. In all seriousness, don't get out and get hurt. I'll be more than happy to help take care of you. I would much rather bring you groceries than visit you in the hospital with a broken hip. So for real, if I can help you in any way, don't do anything that you don't feel safe or comfortable doing. If it does get icy, please let me. And if you don't trust my grocery shopping, I'll drive Nikki and she'll shop for you. That might be a good idea. But anyway, for real, if we can help in any way, please let me know. Hey, just one more thing. I know that in the beginning of the year, I gave you a Bible reading plan that was one sheet for the month of January and told you I would have you the rest of the year before February. The rest of the year is on this trifold thing that I dropped. There's one back there on the glass cabinet. If you'd like to have one to get through the remaining year, that'll get you through the Bible. It's a 5-day reading plan. We'll get you through the Bible this coming year, or this year that we're in, not coming year, this current year. But if you'd like to have one there back there on the glass cabinet. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 3. We've talked about several times if we had to pick a favorite Old Testament book, I know some of us would choose the book of Ruth. For obvious reasons. I mean, it's a short book. It's an easy read. It's an enjoyable read, and it's really easy to get our heads around what's going on. Now, outside of today's chapter and the whole marriage proposal where Ruth lays underneath the sheets at the feet of, I'll try to help us understand that. Outside of that whole, what in the world's going on there? Outside of that, it's all pretty normal. It all makes pretty normal sense to even the way we live and operate in America, a vastly different era even than the setting of Ruth. So it's easy to read, it's easy to follow, it's easy to understand. The plot line is encouraging, it's hopeful. Through the whole thing, we see God's faithfulness even in the darkest of days. But yet, even though it's easy, it's profoundly applicable to our life. There's some great stuff there. So let me just kind of remind us where we're at in the story, and then we're going to read chapter 3 together. There's not many Old Testament books that when I'm preaching, and the way the book's laid out, like we're going to deal chapters at a time, there's not too many books that you read the whole chapter together, and we're going to do that again today. We did that with chapter 1 and chapter 2. We're going to read chapter 3 together in just a moment. But before we get there, let me remind us of how we got there. So the story begins with a couple, Elimelech and Naomi, and their two children, or two sons. There's a famine in the land, so they leave Bethlehem to travel to Moab because it has rained there. There is food there. You guys don't get to see this. Will's at home with Brooke. Continue to pray for Brooke, and Dakota's running the computer, and he's trying to get the camera, and I'm walking all over the stage. He's running back. It's pretty funny. You're missing a great show. Anyway, he's probably thinking, can we get someone else to stand still, please? But anyway, so they leave Bethlehem and go to Moab, and while they're there, they have food. But Elimelech dies. So Naomi's husband dies, and then her two sons marry Moabite women, and they die. And so Naomi finds herself in a foreign country with her two sons, widowed, with her two sons now deceased. So it's Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. Now, here's what we don't know, but I think we can get a pretty good idea. In-law relationships aren't always the easiest, right? Can you imagine being in a foreign country and your only relatives being married-in relatives? So, I mean, there's lots of dynamics here that are interesting. So Naomi, in an effort to preserve her daughters-in-law, she sends them home. So go back to your family. You know, in a patriarchal society, you're not going to have a job. I'm too old to give you another son for you to marry. Just go home. One daughter-in-law does, but not Ruth. Ruth says, no. Let the Lord punish me severely, if anything but death separates you and me. And so they travel back to Bethlehem together, and while there they meet Boaz, and Boaz owns the barley fields, and Boaz allows Ruth to not only gather grain, but gather an abundance of grain, and he offers her protection. And now Ruth and Naomi find themselves, because of the generosity and the grace of Boaz, they're no longer hungry. Their immediate need has been met. But the story will continue in Ruth chapter 3. Last week, I asked the question, and I think it's a fair question that hopefully that maybe even through the week you have you thought about. Wednesday night I was telling the folks here that how weird my brain is. I could be driving nails back there in the bathroom, and if you haven't seen it yet, it looks very different than it did. But I can be back there driving nails in the bathroom thinking about the sufficiency of grace, or who knows what. Like, my mind could be all over the place doing lots of different things. Maybe you've spent some time thinking about the question that I asked last week. And I simply asked, why? Why did Ruth choose to stay with Naomi? Like, why did she risk so much? Why did Boaz selflessly give to ensure that Naomi and Ruth had their needs met? And I argued that because even in a pagan culture, even in a culture that is called by God, but yet is not submitting to God, we know that they aren't, because they're living in the time of the judges, and we know that morally God's people were all over the place. But yet, Ruth, not an Israelite, responds by loving life. Boaz, an Israelite, but yet, remember, we're living in the time of the judges. He chooses to honor life. And I argued that everyone sees the intrinsic value of human life. Ruth said, hey, Naomi needs me to help her survive. So she chooses to sacrifice to ensure that she does everything in her power to make sure Naomi's needs are met. Boaz risked getting the crops out of the field in the name of ensuring that Naomi and Ruth have their needs met. They risked for the value of life. Today, the story will continue. So turn to Ruth chapter 3. Let's read this chapter together. Ruth chapter 3. And the word of God says, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, my daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you will be taken care of? Now, isn't Boaz our relative? Haven't you been working with his female servants? This evening, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfumed oil, and wear your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you were there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he's lying. Go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do. So Ruth said to her, I will do everything you say. She went to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had charged her to do. After Boaz ate and drank and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley, and she came secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. At midnight, Boaz was startled, well, for obvious reasons. Boaz was startled, turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. So he said, who are you? She said, I'm Ruth, your servant. Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer. Then he said, may the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before, because you've not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I. Stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie down until morning. So she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. Then Boaz said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. He told Ruth, bring your shawl you're wearing and hold it out. And when she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into the town. So she went to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who asked her, "What happened, my daughter?" Then Ruth told her everything the man had done for her. And she said, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley because he said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" And Naomi said, "My daughter, wait until you find out how things go, for he won't rest unless he solves this today." Let's pray together. God, thank you for your word. Lord, thank you for this book in the Bible. Lord, while vastly different, difficulty to understand and apply than even the book immediately before. Lord, thank you for all that you do for us, Lord, your provision and your care, Lord, even as we see in the life of Ruth and Naomi in this chapter today. Lord, we love you. We're grateful for you, grateful for your word. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. So let me offer us 3 lessons for life today. And as we work through them, I'll try to help us wrestle with this whole weird laying at Boaz's feet at the threshing floor, because that is weird. I don't recommend, but I'll just let all my cards show. I do not recommend men or women proposing to your future spouse that way. Don't do what they did here. But I'll try to help us understand what's going on here. So, first lesson for life is this: we can be confident and we can trust that God's will is always the best. Now, and we would say, well, yeah, of course, Blake, that's an obvious truth. Now, so just think about where Naomi and Ruth are. They have found themselves some level of security. In Ruth chapter 1, they're hungry. In Ruth chapter 2, their hunger needs are met. But not only are their hunger needs met, but Boaz has ensured that not that they just have one meal, that they have an abundance of food, and he's continued to let Ruth come back to his field, and he's ordered his men to ensure that Ruth stays safe. Their needs, immediate needs, had been met, but yet the law demanded more. Remember, we're in the time of the judges. We're not exactly living out the law, but that the law required was called a Levirate marriage. And it's this idea that to preserve family line or to carry on the lineage, if your brother was to die, you would take his widow as your wife and have kids with her to carry on his line. Now remember, we're in a vastly different even population than we are right now. The command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth in Genesis chapter 1 is significant. That's why the law mandated this. Like when you figure in death rates and the life expectancy vastly shorter than now, death is a really bad thing in a world that is struggling with population. So God says, hey, my people, those that follow me, this is my very clear command to you. It's not a desire to marry your sister-in-law. It's a command rooted in the biblical mandate to multiply and fill the earth. For the nation of Israel to continue to flourish, family lines had to expand. So Naomi and Ruth, their immediate needs have been met, but Naomi says, wait a second, there's more. Like, I don't have any more sons for Ruth to marry, but yet there is a kinsman redeemer. Like Boaz should be more to us than just the one who provides grain for us. She sees the need. She recognizes what God says. So she sends Ruth, say, hey, listen, you go to Boaz and you meet up with him and remind him that he's a kinsman redeemer. He'll be a man of his word. He'll be a man that honors the Lord. He's already proved that. So if Ruth married Boaz, Ruth would have long-term security. So she not only would have food today, but she would have a child who would continue to provide even after Boaz's death. This is long-term security for Ruth. So Naomi sends Ruth. Now, follow me for just a second. So like this is really, we don't live anything like that. Like, are you telling me that I need to marry my sister-in-law? I'm not saying that. I mean, we live in a different time. I'm not saying if you already have a wife, get a second one. I'm not saying that at all. I think that's a terrible idea, by the way. I can hardly keep up with one. I can't imagine two. I'm not saying that at all. But yet there is a great lesson for us to learn here. See, because you and I are tempted to be so self-absorbed that when we have a problem, when that problem is solved, we don't continue to pursue what God calls us to. Like we're in the moment, the problem can be so pressing that we forget that God has greater plans than for you and I to have our immediate need met. I don't know whatever that need is in your family. For them, it's food. Hey, they have something to eat. So, hey, let's party. Let's eat the food. Let's pursue life because now we have something to eat. But no, God has more than that. Like there's a mandate to multiply and fill the earth. And Boaz can be that guy. He is the kinsman redeemer. You and I, when we are living our life, we must recognize that God has greater plans than for you and I to live for ourselves. Because the problem is, when you and I have a problem, we focus on that. When God meets that need, we're looking to the next problem, right? Like it's just constant. Hungry today, bill needs paid today, whatever it is, the medical need, whatever it is. Lord, this is overwhelming. I can't handle it. And then when we move past that, because God is so gracious to us, just think back at your life. How many times have you had something you thought, I'll never recover from this? And that was 50 years ago, and yet here you are. And that problem was so minor. Like, everybody knows this story, but I'll tell it to you anyway, because this is like I thought you were going to get a new pastor right after we moved here. I took my computer. I'm telling you the story so Nikki can't. That's what I'm doing. So I had a computer that I purchased online from the Facebook Marketplace because that's always a way to buy your electronics. But the computer was a great computer. It crashed, and I had Apple protection, so I took it to the mall, to the Apple store, and the guy says, hey, I just need to reboot it. Is there anything on here that you don't need? And I said, was there anything on it? He said, no, not really. And I said, well, yeah. Reset it. Now, I'm not blaming it on the Apple guy because my wife told me that she took all the pictures of the twins' birth and put them on that computer and emptied the memory card for the camera. We have one picture from the twins' birth, and I'm the one holding it. To add insult to injury, it's not even of the wife, it's of me. I mean, honest mistake. Whew, you can imagine, I hadn't ate dinner yet. We did not eat dinner in Tulsa that night. And it was a very long ride home from 71st and Memorial. And the whole time I'm thinking, the marriage probably won't survive this one. Like, I did it here. Now, praise God. Her mom had some pictures, my mom, none of them in the delivery room, but there is some pictures of the first week at the hospital. We made it. I had that moment, I didn't know. I know that in the grand scheme of things, you're saying like it's just pictures. I understand that, but don't tell my wife that. But for real, huge, huge problem. Looking back, still a big deal. I'm not saying it's not a big deal. Pictures of our kids' birth were small mountains compared to other things we had to deal with in marriage. Let's be honest. Now, do I wish we still had pictures of the twins' birth? Absolutely, I do. For sure, I wish I didn't have or wouldn't have done that. Let's be honest. How many times have you said, man, I'm not going to survive this? The doctor says the likelihood of recovering from this is almost zero. Or they're going to shut the electric off. Or where's the money going to be to make the car payment? Or you've been in those moments. Those are behind you. And you probably look back saying, man, I freaked out for nothing. Like there's just so much more to life. See, we go through this with every hurdle we face. The next one is larger than the last one. Like, how will I ever survive? And pretty soon, we've lived our life self-absorbed, self-consumed, forgetting that God has called us to a greater purpose than having this momentary need met. For Ruth and Naomi, it was food. When there was a biblical mandate to multiply and fill the earth, Ruth needs a husband. More than they need to eat. Because there's a biblical mandate that doesn't say eat till your belly's full. there's a biblical mandate. This is multiply and fill the earth. We must understand that God and his glory are far greater than those things that we're struggling with right now. We must look to the Lord and his greater plan. The second thing we learn is that we cannot allow the comfort of life to cause us to not seek the Lord. Remember, their need was hunger, their need was met. They could have said, hey, we're no longer in danger of starving. They've traveled to Bethlehem. They're hoping to find food. They find the food. Boaz provides the security they need. And now they face a very real temptation. They no longer have a desperate need. The need has been met. So what will they live for? We can sit at home until the food runs out, then we can go back and find. No, they didn't live like that. Their desperate need had been met. And instead of consuming themselves with their met needs, they turned their focus to the one who has given them life. And they seek the Lord for a greater thing than their momentary problem. Now, you and I, we face the same temptation. We live in an affluent society. Affluent society, not fluent as in we speak well. Our needs are met, let's be honest. Even though some of us have more money than others in the room, or some of us are better off financially than others, every one of us in this room, compared to the rest of the world, are wealthy. Every one of us. We got water in the house. If not, it's in the house. We have access to it, even if we have to drive to Pipe Springs to get it. I'm not saying you should drink from Pipe Springs, but whatever. If you want to, go for it. For real, though, comparatively speaking, we are rich. Like, we are blessed people. Like, we flip on a switch and turn on electricity. I went on a death call this week, Wednesday night, that there was no turning on a switch to have electricity in the home to which this person had passed away in. I'm pretty sure, for the speaking, you and I in this room, we're blessed people. And you and I face the same temptation that Ruth and Naomi face. We can focus on ourselves and say, this is what I want, or this is what I need. And we face this temptation to be self-absorbed. We face this temptation that the comfort of life can cause us to be content in what the Lord has given us. Wednesday night, in Ephesians chapter 4, we talk about the command to not be greedy. And while I've tried to make the point that we don't like to talk about greed because none of us want to think that we're greedy. And Mike and I have went back and forth, not arguing, but like trying to get our head around, how do you define greed? Like, for real, like, you can open up what Merriam-Webster says, but let's not worry about what Merriam-Webster says. What does God say greed is? Like, how does he define greed? And I've been, so, well, Mike, what if the definition of greed is not the fact that you want more money, but the definition of greed is that you get more money because you're going to work even though you don't need it, or whatever, you're continuing to make this money, but God says, give it here, and you say no. So greed's not the dollar amount. Greed's how tight the fist is. Ooh, I don't like to think about that. Like, so you and I face this temptation. Will we be content in the Lord and follow his commands, even though we're really comfortable? Will we say, yes, Lord? Or will we follow the comfort of life to just let us coast to the end? Ruth and Naomi don't choose that. They choose the Lord. Number 3. The third lesson for life is God is able to transform our mourning into joy. Now, let's be honest. Most of us in this room have not been in the situation that Naomi's in. Like, I've not been widowed, and I haven't buried my children. Big fears in our lives. We don't want to go through that. Some of us have. And you would say, you don't want to go through this. Like, you don't want to do this. Like, grief is brutal. But right here in chapter 3, we see the provision of the Lord come to fruition in such a way that we didn't even expect coming in chapter 2. Ruth, young widow lady, no children, not in her hometown, far away from her family. But God provides Boaz. But now follow this. For the plan to work, Naomi tells Ruth, put on your best clothes. You say, well, she just wants to have on pretty clothes when she sees Boaz. That's not what this means. We live in a culture, this era, that when you were grieving, you dressed like you were grieving. We assume, by the way the story reads, that Ruth is living still in her grief clothes. And Naomi says, get up. Take off the clothes of mourning. That's mourning. Take off the grief clothes. Put on your best clothes and go see Boaz. And she does it. This passage, an amazing testament to the Lord's faithful provision. Not only was she given food and security, she's given a family, a husband. Children would now be possible. Today, 2023, in Locust Grove, Oklahoma, you and I serve the same God that gave Boaz to Ruth. He is able to transform our mourning into joy. It's difficult to work through grief. I often tell a family when I preach a funeral, some of you may have heard me say this. We're standing at the graveside, and as we're getting ready to let the casket down, and somehow the Lord has tasked me with the responsibility to be able to point your hearts to the only thing that can provide an anchor in the midst of the most dark day of your life, the Lord. Because it's frightening to go home to the quiet house. And here we're standing at the graveside, and I typically say something along the lines of, hey, let me just remind you of who God is. And we read the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down beside green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. And then I pause and make a joke. He does not say he leads me to Norman. FYI, God's an OSU fan. He leads you to Stillwater. And then we continue on. Anyway, trying to make light in a difficult moment. We continue to read the 23rd Psalm. And I remind you that grief is brutal. Because you're going to walk away from here, and one day you're going to have a good day. And you're going to wake up, and there may even be a smile on your face, and you're immediately going to feel guilty for being happy. And this goes on for a long time. Grief is nasty. It's brutal. It's hard. I had to call my grandmother on Thursday. It's the anniversary from my uncle committed suicide. Like, my grandmother went out to eat with mom and dad, her only living child now. Mom and dad took her out to eat because my grandmother is divorced when mom was in middle school, has never been married. She's living alone, lost a daughter in July to COVID, and a little over a year later, her son commits suicide. And my grandmother is a loner by personality, and it terrifies my mother, obviously, because my grandmother, she just sat at home in a dark house and not go do anything. And mom got her out of the house to go eat Thursday, but just visiting on the phone. My wife and kids and the Hubbards are at Los Cocos. We're having a blast. And my grandmother calls me back, and I step outside. Even my grandmother, a year from now, wrestling with the guilt of, I went and ate dinner. I had a good time with your mom. It's hard. Grief is brutal. Let me just ask you this question. We'll move on. Do you trust the Lord enough to lay aside the markers of the past and trust him to carry you into the future? Naomi says, Ruth, if you want this to work, take off the clothes of grief. Put on your good clothes and go meet Boaz. Do you trust the Lord enough to lay aside the markers of the past and trust him to carry you into the future. Ruth trusts the Lord to be her provision, and he was. He'll be the same for you today. And the last lesson for life is this. Honoring the Lord or honoring God requires us to put the needs of others ahead of ourselves. Now, why does Ruth sneak into Boaz's bed? I mean, that's the question that has been hung in our head since we read through is why? Like, what a weird moment. I mean, while I've never threshed grain in this moment, I have ran a combine, I have harvested grain from the field, but none of us have stood in a threshing floor and thrown the grain into the air and let the wind blow the chaff away, and that's what Boaz has been doing. So Boaz is down in the threshing pit. He's picking up the grain. He's throwing it in the air. The wind is separating the grain from the chaff. The heavy pebbles fall. The wind carries the chaff away. And, it sounds like a brutal, itchy job, by the way, but that's what he's doing. When he gets done, he'll eat. Don't assume that he gets done drinking, he's drunk. That's not what this means at all. But when the harvest is over, the grain is threshed, it is then that Boaz will have a nice meal and rest. If you've been on a farm, you know what I mean. Harvest is crazy. Lots of hours. Because if you don't get the grain out of the field, the rain is coming. So Boaz isn't rested yet. But tonight he will. Why? Because harvest is over. When he is 8, when his job is over, uncover his feet and lay down beside him. Why? Now, here's the deal. I don't know. We just know that this was a sign of proposal in this moment. Now, don't walk out here and say, I'm going to propose like that. Don't do that. You will end up shot or in jail. Do not do this. But in this time, this is what happened. But notice, Boaz does not wake up and find a young, vulnerable woman in his bed and enjoy the night with her. She does not put the moves on him, if you will. She doesn't seduce Boaz. They meet each other at his bed and walk away from that bed with a commitment to fulfill God's command. Vastly different than our culture today, huh? They share the bed together and walk away and fulfill God's intention in marriage. Boaz, much older than Ruth, probably not thinking about having another wife, but yet God says he's a kinsman redeemer. His job, according to the law, is to marry her. Instead of avoiding Ruth, he agrees. But yet he knows there's a relative who is closer than himself. So he doesn't take the young, honorable woman to be his wife without first ensuring that the closest kinsman redeemer does not desire to marry her. That's what we'll talk about next week. He makes his commitment known. If the closest redeemer is not willing to marry you, I will. Why? Not because Boaz wants to trade in for a newer model. Because Boaz desires to honor the Lord. And this is the command of the Lord, so he does it. Today, you and I must commit to honor the Lord in all that we do. We will have to sacrifice. It will require putting the needs of others ahead of our own desires. But when we live for the glory of God alone, he's honored in that. So here we find ourselves, the middle of the book. So we're actually past the middle. We're in the last 75%, if you will. It's not, and yet we see over and over and over again, following the Lord isn't easy. It's difficult and painful, but it's worth it. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz all live that. Throughout chapter 3, they put the needs of others ahead of themselves and the glory of God ahead of their own desires. They teach us that God's will is the best. That God's plan is the best. The model for us that when we cannot allow or we cannot afford to allow the comfort of life to distract us from seeking the Lord. That they see, that we watch how God transforms mourning into joy. But for all of this to happen, they have to be willing to say, yes, Lord. So, will you say yes, Lord? Is God's glory enough for you? His plan, His purpose, His intention, His name to be known among the nations, is that enough for you? The reason this story is so great is because it was for Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. If you desire your children to read back on your life, and you want them to read your life with the joy that we read Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, we must choose God and His glory over everything else. Let me pray for us. Lord, we love you. Lord, we're grateful